All right, hello and happy new year. Thanks for joining us today for the first Forgotten Foundations of Fundraising webinar in 2022. Clearly, we're starting off the year on a particularly exciting topic with databases today, everyone's favorite. But before we jump into databases, I'm going to introduce myself and our guests. I'm Austin Detweiler. I'm the managing editor of Philanthropy Daily, which co-hosts these webinars with American Philanthropic. I know many of you are regular readers of Philanthropy Daily by now, but if you're not, you can find us at philanthropydaily.com. We're an online publication focused on philanthropy and civil society. Our mission is to strengthen civil society by providing commentary on the philanthropic sector, on donors, and by providing free and useful advice for nonprofit professionals. Why is because we believe that nonprofit organizations and their many missions are essential for a thriving American democracy, which depends upon voluntary associations. It's this space where diverse citizens gather around shared values, beliefs, and purposes. That's what we do every day in building nonprofits, is creating a space where democracy and civil society can thrive. That's why we always say very sincerely, thank you for the work you do as fundraisers, which is essential to our civil society. I know you're all coming off of a really busy year end. I'm sure it was stressful. I hope you got some time to rest. And now we're excited to jump into a new year ahead. And we're here today, hopefully to help you in some small way and probably to learn something ourselves. If you don't know Philanthropy Daily, you want to get a good feel for us, the time is ripe right now. We just put out our annual year in review article. We look back over the themes and topics we were discussing in 2021. You can check that out on our homepage, and I'm pretty sure you'll find something you're interested in. If you don't, please email me, and I'll make sure we start talking about something that you do find interesting. But that's enough background. Today, we're here to discuss nonprofit CRMs, databases, and why they aggravate you. I have the pleasure today of being joined by two of my friends and colleagues, Devon Ironside and Cecilia Diem. So Devon recently wrote a 4-part series for Philanthropy Daily, provocatively titled, "Everyone's Database Sucks." If you haven't seen it, you should check it out. So the impetus in writing it, he tells us, is that nearly everyone finds their database to be a huge pain in the butt. You probably agree. Precious few are the nonprofit professionals who delight in using their database, and if they exist, they probably aren't fundraisers. And what's more, once that aggravation reaches a certain pitch and they're ready to fix it, the most common response is just get a new database. Devon says that's not the best solution. He explains 4 specific problem areas in those articles. He calls them perceptions, people, processes, and only then look at the platform. He's going to tell us more about that in just a minute. Before I hand it off to him, let me tell you a little bit about how we're going to do this today. So Devon is American Philanthropic's Director of Data Services. He runs all of AmPhil's database work, from doing new builds for clients to fixing their problems and finding their solutions to providing ongoing database administrative services. So he's our database expert, and he's eager to use to help us use our databases better and understand our database better, and ultimately to make the database work better for us. So you can think of him as our counselor today. If your database sucks, Devon is going to help you understand why and what to do about it. Now, Cecilia is a managing consultant with American Philanthropic, and before that, she worked in fundraising at the Philanthropy Roundtable, at Americans for Prosperity, and the National Museum of Women in the Arts. And today she's working with a lot of nonprofits, helping them raise money and advance their missions. So she has been and still is the frustrated fundraiser using the database. So here's what we're going to do. Devon and Celia are going to have a conversation about databases, asking some of the questions that many of us have had and still have as fundraisers, trying to use it well and understand it well. So we've got some questions, but as always, please put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat box. Celia and I will keep an eye on them, and that way we'll make sure we cover your specific questions too. But with that, let me jump right in. Devon, tell us a little bit about the series, and then we'll just go into some questions.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. It's really exciting to talk about databases first in the year, at least for me, if not for anybody else on this call. And I think it's really timely because probably coming through the end of the year and starting the new year, more than most times throughout the year, your database actually probably you had some interaction with it. End of year mailings, getting in those last pledges, making sure people are actually committing and getting that money in the door. Then you've got to get your tax receipts out. So we're interacting with our data and our databases a lot at the end of the year, the beginning of the year. So this is actually a pretty timely session, I think, to have. I wrote this series in anticipation of this webinar. Everyone's database sucks because everybody's going to have, some unique problems they have with their database, and that does require, one-off sort of solutions or kind of thinking, one-on-one what your particular issue is. So the purpose of the series wasn't to answer everyone's problems, but to give them more of a framework through which to view their problems. A lot of times people, come to me and they do say, like, man, I just feel like my database sucks. The title is actually a real thing I hear, right? And even though I'm playing the counselor or therapist today, I can't only ask, how does that make you feel? Because I know how it makes people feel. Frustrated. They hate it. They hate it to death. They don't want to have to deal with this. They want to understand what's going on or what's going wrong or something like that. So the idea behind that article, or that series of articles, was to try and put things in some perspective and get you thinking in the right ways. And like Austin said, very quickly people say, we've got a problem with the database. Let's just throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so that's why I say, well, first off, let's look at our perceptions. What do we think a database is, and what is it supposed to do, and how are we supposed to use it and interact with it? And then once we kind of have a correct idea of what this thing's supposed to be doing, do we have the right people in place? Are people wearing the right hats, or is there just a huge gap of just nobody there to pull the right levers and get things done? And then once you do have people in place, are the things they doing making sense? The process question, right? I'm Canadian, so I'll be saying process a lot. Sorry about that. But is that process, making sense? Is it scalable, and is it effective for our organization? And then finally, once you've looked at and asked those questions, it may be that your platform, that your what we think of as the database, right? The actual platform you're using is bad or is wrong or is not right for you. But you don't want to run to that question first. So that's the purpose of those articles. More than happy to talk about specifics in them. But yeah, that's the thrust of it.
So I would love to jump in here and just, if that's okay, Austin. And so I want you to answer this question, Devon, but I also have an answer myself. So why does any of this matter? Why does it matter if we have a good database? Why does it matter if you have the right platform processes and people?
Yeah, it's actually a question I put some thought to because I deal with this every day. It's so much a part of what we do for our clients. It's so much a part of what I personally value and like that it's the water you swim in. So it's kind of hard to see it. What's so valuable about all this sort of stuff, right? Why do we need a database? Well, your database is you house everything you're doing or have done or will do is housed somewhere. For instance, you're keeping it in your head, or you're keeping it somewhere written down on paper, or you might, if you have a database, you're putting it digitally somewhere, but you are tracking things in your head, or your donors, your donations, your campaigns, your events, your volunteers, grants, you can go on, right? You are tracking it somewhere. So it's really important to have it in a place where you're going to be able to share it with all of your staff. That institutional knowledge is not lost. When people leave, when people go on maternity leave, or whatever, you don't have these huge gaps where somebody's gone and they knew everything. This happens a lot with founders, with CEOs, with executive directors. They know everybody, and they never download that to some place that lets everybody else access that. So, I could go on for forever, but that's some of the big reasons. Like, it just gives us, a central nexus from which so much of our development and fundraising success can outflow. But we need it all there in one place.
So records keeping, basically, like you have to have a record.
That sounds so boring. That sounds so terrible.
It does. I'm
right.
sorry
Yeah,
to make it boring, but this is my job, is to make you seem boring because you're the database guy. So
sure,
I would take this a step further. I would say that from the fundraising perspective, why good data matters is because if you've been here for a while, you've heard us all use this expression. Being near, dear, and clear with your donors is how you raise money. It's how you build relationships. It's how you bring your donors into the life of your organization. And if you cannot communicate with your donors, you cannot remain near, dear, and clear with them. And the database is what facilitates that communication, whether it's mass emails to your $100 donors or the ability to hyper personalize your, soft credit end of year mailings handwritten by your president to your 100K plus donors. If your database isn't good, if the right data isn't in there, and if you don't have the right people, processes, and sorry, I forgot the other 2 P's in that list.
That's right.
In
All
order,
4.
you're not going to be able to get the donor communication out that needs to happen. So yes, records keeping, legacy planning, and communication with donors, I'd say that's
100%.
what matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess let me jump in here and ask you again. So the end users of a database, so we're primarily fundraising consultants. We do a lot of other things too, but when we think about databases, we think about how is the fundraising team using them? Are they working for development? In your articles, you point out that fundraisers are the end users of the database. So they kind of need to be crafted around the needs of the fundraising department. Is that always true?
Well, in the case of a fundraising or development database, I suppose it is. You have a lot of people wearing different hats. You've got your executive champions, who are your executive directors, your CEOs. They are going to be the people who are making sure their fundraisers have the tools they need. You're going to have your admins, you're going to have your data entry people, but your fundraisers, like you said, that database is a tool for them to do their job. It's nothing more, nothing less, really. A database isn't magical and it's not scary. It's just a tool. You've got to have it in the right hands of people to do their jobs well. And in the case of a development database, it's your development folks, the people going out and making asks, whether it's your legacy folks, whether it's your grants management folks, all those people need it. So it has to serve them first, in my view. Now, a lot of times people say, well, our accounting team needs X, our marketing or communications people need Y. And you never want to have a completely siloed sandbox. It's not what the articles claim, it's not what we're claiming, but what happens oftentimes is that the marketing people or the accounting folks or the communications folks or whomever, the programs people, this happens oftentimes, they get whatever they want in their database. And the fundraising people, the people that actually make the money and keep the doors open, keep the lights on, they're left with the scraps. So I've seen development departments trying to handle their moves management and donor management out of QuickBooks or out of MailChimp. These platforms that are perfectly fine for their use case, but not good for what a development officer needs to actually do. And these development officers are pulling their hair out. And it's like, yeah, that's a perfect example of where the platform is wrong. It's a bad platform for you to be doing it in. So 100%, I think I really like to champion the development folks. They need to have a system that works for them, that has their needs in mind, 100%.
So then let me ask this, how do you know? Okay, so if you're building your database with development in mind, which makes sense because there's no organization if there's no money, right? It does make sense to prioritize the needs of your fundraising department. How do you go about, so let's say that you have, of course, people have programs, right? You're not a nonprofit if you don't have a program. So your program team needs something different. They need they're tracking a whole different kind of account. Maybe you're a school and you need to be able to track like parents and siblings and stuff like that. How do you know when it's time to set up a different system for another department versus when it's time to try to use some kind of an API or a integration?
Mm-hmm. So, if you're trying to use the same system for a lot of different use cases, and while for accounting this might not work, but let's use the example, marketing. Very often marketing will say, well, we're using the same system as your development folks. That's fine if both parties can get what they need out of the system. But if one group's, I would argue, if one group's, tasks are starting to be hampered, their productivity is being hampered because they are being forced into a system or being forced to use something that doesn't work well for them, then it might be best to say, you know what, for that school, they need like a student management, system, right? They need something that's actually going to track grades, capture all that information, not even just from a productivity standpoint, it might even just be from a legality standpoint, right? You need to also consider, should everyone have access to the accounting, data? Should everyone have access to all the student records and things like that? So there's a lot of different considerations you have to put to think through. But yeah, I would say you don't want the platforms people are using to really become a bottleneck simply because you want everybody to play in the same pool. If it just doesn't make sense, don't force it.
I'm going to add one thing to that I learned from your article, Devon. So I think like part of the answer to the question is budgetary, right? Like as much as your budget can afford diversify. But once you've diversified across databases, the question is like, how much do we integrate them and like set up APIs and automation so that this thing goes from here and goes to here? And this never occurred to me until I read your articles. But you point out that automations are about scaling something, right? Like automations don't fix a problem, because if you can't move information from here to here manually, then setting up an automation isn't going to fix it for you. It's like, I can do it manually, but it's time consuming and there's a lot of it, right? Mm-hmm. So like you get more databases for different people when you can afford it. You integrate them when it matters and when it's possible. Is that right?
Yeah, and when it's useful too. Is it useful to actually have that information in one system versus the other, right? But 100%. A lot of clients will come and they'll say, well, we want these integrated, or we want this automated. We want this process just turned, click of a button and it just, automates it. And that's good in certain situations, but you're never going to automate your way out of a problem that's already there, right? If this data doesn't actually match up from one system to another, or if the data is not clean, that's another personal thing. People say, well, we got loads of duplicates and the data is not clean and like that, so let's just automate donations coming in, and that might be part of the solution and kind of cleaning up the whole process there. But don't just think that an automation is going to make things better. It's just like you say, it's just going to automate a process you already did manually. But also, it's not removing work necessarily. It's changing the work that you do. So a lot of times people go into automations, or even kind of go into like, I want a hard-coded API integration or something like that. Why? Well, because they don't want to deal with this, right? I want to do any work, or I want my people to be, not having to work on this. And what you're doing is just scaling that person's time so they're more effective and they can handle more quantity work. Why? Because they're going to be dealing with the integration. You still want that person, whether they've got an automation or an integration going on, you still want your admins to be watching over that, making sure that it's not breaking. These things break all the time. If there's been a little bit of an update on one system or another system or whatever app you're using to bridge it, it can break, it can be errors. So you're just changing the work that person does, and it's scaling them so they can now manage hundreds or thousands, let's say, of donations versus putting those in one by one. One of the questions that does come up, so I don't know if somebody's going to ask this, but one of the questions that people come up and they say, like, how can I make sure my system's ready to grow? How do I know that we've got growth mindset, we're building a strong foundation? And this may not make sense, but I was thinking about it. I was like, well, maybe it kind of makes sense. I try to avoid linear relationships between my people and their tasks. Meaning, if I've got a person who has to put in a donation, and they have one donation, they put it in, great. And they have two donations, okay, they manually put it in, great. 3, 4, and so on and so forth. If they got 100 donations and that person has to manually put them in, that's a linear relationship. They have to do the same thing 100 times. That's not scalable. Once you do 1,000, 2,000 donations, you can't have the same process being done by one person. It'll take a lifetime. So you need relationships between your tasks and people, or your processes and people, that are a little more exponential, right? I'm setting up an automation so this one staff member can oversee 1,000 donations, and they're just making sure that integration and that automation is working, or they're mass uploading them or something like that. So growth really depends on not building linear processes where it's just like more nose to the grind, white knuckling this sort of work.
Yeah, I mean, and this is what you wrote in the article too, what you say all the time, like set it and forget it's not the motto here, right? Like, so it's one person does 1,000 things as quickly as he used to do 10 things or something like that.
Exactly.
Not that he does one, he sets it up and no one ever has to do it again. That's
Exactly.
really cool.
Yeah.
That's a really important point. I think so. Another issue that comes up a lot for me with clients and also in fundraising in general. So, you have the black box problem, right? Where everyone except the person who actually designed the database is like, I don't know, it's a thing. It seems complicated. We should get someone who can run it and manage it. And when you go out and post your job description looking for a database admin, a lot of times you see they want 5 years of experience. They want you to have a bunch of licenses before you even consider applying. And I think that all comes from a really good place of just saying, okay, I don't know anything about this, so we should hire someone who is definitely an expert in this, and we'll never have to think about it again. what do you look for, or what would you recommend on the personnel side for for the database admin role?
Yeah, people generally want a unicorn, right? They generally want somebody who can do it all and make breakfast at the same time. And they generally don't want to pay for a unicorn. It's just the way it is. People do not want to pay what somebody who can do it, 5 years expertise, certifications in this or that, can code if they need to. And they might also have a false perception of what they truly need. I think it comes from this place of kind of, again, a fire and forget mentality, Austin. They want to just hire somebody and never have to deal with or worry about like anything ever again in life of that organization or that person. Getting somebody who can grow into that role is actually perfectly feasible. When I think about who I want for a database admin, I don't actually want the sort of stereotypical IT, person who doesn't, work well with people maybe, or kind of, like they're misanthrope or something. They're just like, oh yeah, they just enjoy working with numbers, right? Actually, for a database admin, that's a little bit counterproductive. I need somebody with discernment. So I need somebody who's going to be able to make good judgment calls and really wants to take ownership of the system. Just having somebody who, again, for your admin, just having somebody who is, hey, they're very detail oriented. Detail oriented is fine, it's good, but I need more than that. I need them to know when to ask the question of, should we actually build this field? Is this report actually worth us taking 2 weeks to do? Can I go back to my boss and maybe translate their needs into something slightly different, right? So you want somebody who's got some discernment, they're conscientious. I think somebody with a gift of enablement. They're really looking to help other people do their jobs better, right? Remember, the database is a tool. So I want somebody who's going to be able to show other people how that tool works and utilizing it well. And so from that, I want somebody who can help enable my fundraisers and my other staff, and who's not, who's kind of autodidactic. They're willing to learn not only the system, but learn what their colleagues need. So learning both sides of that so they can plug those two together. If I only love the system, if I only love the database, and I don't love, my colleagues or our mission or our program, like you actually do need a passion for that, right? So that you know what it is they need and you're building a system with them in mind, right? So I'm looking for those traits. I'm also looking for somebody who is willing to kind of have a slightly higher loyalty to the organization and their ownership of the system than simply just being a yes man when it comes to a request from a boss. All right. Now, some bosses are great, but some bosses are terrible about this. And they say, I want this way. And that can start you going down a road of shoot, now we've got a bunch of duplicate data, or shoot, now we did this to appease somebody and it's a complete disaster. And it can go down a bad road. So having somebody who's really willing to take the ownership, along with those other characteristics I just described, that's really what I like to look for, honestly, in a database admin.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. I think that like humility and good humor, I would also throw in. I mean, honestly, database admins are going to be given the short end of the stick a lot of the time, right? Something goes wrong and it's like, well, let's look at the data. And you really need someone who is going to be collegial about it. And then also someone who, when they're asked to pull the data, says, this is what you're asking for. Are you sure you don't actually mean why? Because why makes more sense in the context that I have. Because
it's more than just a functionary role. They really
Yeah.
have to be more engaged in it than just a bean counter.
Yeah. Yep.
I can't say how many times I've called Devon and said, hey, can you do this for me because I need something? And Devon exercises the virtue of discernment and says, I'm not going to do that for you because you don't need it. And then actually gets me what I need, which I think is what you're getting at there, Devon, is like somebody who knows a little bit about the end user's goals, is willing to think through it, and then cares enough to say no, but then also cares enough to like do what they need, which is very different than somebody just says, sure, I'll get you that pointless thing that you think you need.
Exactly. And as I also, I think I lay out in the second article, in people, they're not to be a tyrannical, tyrant of the system. They're not to be a petty dictator, and they're not to be a roadblock. It's that real balancing act of taking ownership and yet trying to empower people with your database, and not just saying, no, that'd be too much work. No, I don't want to do that. No, it's going to cause problems. Like, you're there to serve the organization, to serve the mission, and by virtue of that, then work with the people that are out there trying to fundraise. So like, you really do want that collegiality, like Cecilia mentioned.
So then, okay, building off of that, you mentioned, when do you know when to say no to your supervisor, right? You want an admin who's going to say, that's a terrible thing you want us to do to this
Sure.
system. When do you want to like add fields? Is it a less is more situation with databases where, the fewer fields we have, the cleaner the data will be? Or is it appropriate sometimes to add fields? And how do you know when it is?
Yeah. Don't be scared to add fields. Don't be scared. Again, it kind of comes with that ownership mentality of, oddly enough, if somebody doesn't feel like they're an owner of a system, they might actually be recalcitrant to truly make any changes or modifications or edits and think through, man, would one or two fields actually make people's lives a lot easier? I was thinking through, years ago, working with clients of, we're trying to manage our donors and manage our pipeline and all the donors in our particular MGO portfolios. How do we just like get them into some categories and kind of sort them around? And I said, well, why don't we just create a pick list that has the different statuses or the different stages of a major donor life cycle? If I just give you a pick list that says, hey, this person's in the introduction or in the cultivation or in the solicitation or the stewardship stage, wouldn't that be helpful to give you some place to kind of like push people into some different kind of pens so you can kind of, more easily deal with smaller groups of people? And they're like, oh yeah, that's great, right? So it's totally fine to add fields and to be thinking through, what do my fundraisers, my gift officers, what do they need? What would serve them well? You don't, you want to be careful about adding fields because sometimes it's just a slapdash solution or band-aid solution to fix a more longer term problem that maybe has a different a need. So conversely, sometimes what I will do with my clients, and I'll even say this to them, I'll say like, I need you to justify what you're asking me to do. So you said, hey, Devon, can we build some field like checkbox to do something like this, right? And it's like, let's think through that. Can you really justify to me why you want that? It's not that I won't do it. It's not that I even disagree with you doing it, but I want you to think through why this is going to be useful to you. Because if the person asking for it has actually thought that through, then chances are they're actually going to be more willing to use it. Man, all the time I see people build fields on a whim and they never get used. And 3 years down the line, somebody else comes in and they say, what are all these fields for? I don't know, better not touch them because they've been here since forever. And that's where I would honestly say, feel free to do an audit. Again, admins, take ownership, do an audit of your system, go through the fields and be like, hey, if I don't know what this is here for, let me go and ask some people who might. And if they don't, trash them. If it means nothing to people, trash it. So, my one caveat to that is, don't trash legacy IDs, and try not to trash maybe some important financial information. Like obviously it depends on these things. I'm not saying just go and dump everything, right? I can just see admins now giving the right to flush everything down the toilet. But there's lots you can probably go through and like, hey, let's clean this up. Don't be afraid to take ownership of that and clean your system up.
Yeah. I think I've had some situations arise where people want to add a field that's, like, oh, this is an active donor, so let's make a field where we can enter if this is an active donor or not. I'm like, well, we should know by their gift records if they're an active donor. That's like, so it's, you kind of have to just figure out, it depends on what type of field. Are you trying to create a field that's going to give you information that is already available elsewhere that should really just be tied better or perhaps better connected to the field? So
well,
okay.
and what you even mentioned, Cecilia, if I can't even borrow that, is people, that's a perfect example of, hey, I want a field to say this person's an active donor, right? And many times it's like, well, look, what's your active house file, last 12 months, last 24 months, think through it that way. There's your active house file. You don't need another field to capture that. On the other hand, sometimes for some clients, there is a need for that field because they actually say the reverse of that, right? They say, we only care about people that are in our active house file. That's the last 12 months. Those are our donors. That's all we can care about. And then I say, well, okay, but what about a foundation that gave to you in April of last year, and this year they don't disperse to you until October? If you're waiting 12 months and you're kicking them off your house file list, suddenly they're not receiving your mail. Now people might say, well, they're a foundation, they shouldn't receive your house file mailing list or something like that, and they're wrong. They should be communicated with. So they've got those things, or maybe even it's just a donor, right? A major donor, and they're donating at different times and stuff. So sometimes there is some value to having some of those different fields. But the most important point, like you're saying there, Cecilia, is talking it through, thinking it through, and seeing what is going to be effective and useful for us. And each organization is a little bit different. There's not necessarily a blanket right answer to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's great. So another thing that comes up a lot. So let's say that let's say we've got an organization. They actually went through all of they finally went through people and processes, and they got all the way to platform, and they got their new platform, and it's shiny and it's new and it costs a lot of money, and they really want to keep it perfect in every possible way. So they say, I'm not going to give anyone permission to change anything in this system for any reason. And I don't want people to even, it's like in Spinal Tap. It's like, don't even look at that. I'm not even gonna let you see the stuff in there. You can't even look at that anymore. Is that appropriate? Is that healthy? Like, what's the right permission level? What's the, what's the guiding rule for setting permissions and access?
Yeah, so I think it's again in the second article where I say, your end users are not children. So don't treat them like that, right? Your fundraisers are not children, so don't treat them like that. You definitely want to be cognizant of what can people see, what permissions they have. Is there an intern that maybe shouldn't see, donor data and that sort of stuff. What's more important though is to not cultivate a culture of secrecy or of we don't trust our people to make any changes to the system. I know some clients, they'll say, we only want the admin to change people's addresses and that sort of stuff. We only want any information on a record can only be changed by an admin. That creates a huge bottleneck, and it also prevents you're not enabling your gift staff to make some changes where needed, to make some notes where needed. And so you're really kind of shoving everything into your admin's role. They're going to get overwhelmed. Things are going to get done. And you're kind of even robbing your end users from a little bit of ownership actually over their records or their their donors or people that they are managing, that sort of stuff. So I would say the general rule is I try to keep things very egalitarian. I try not to hide records of donors from one gift officer versus another gift officer. I just don't see a world. I've never seen an organization where that's indicative of a healthy fundraising development culture. It's just probably indicative of other bigger things. If you're getting to be that secretive or that kind of clamped down on who's seeing what in that nature. Obviously, you need to have system admins who can see everything, do everything, and you do want to keep people off the grass. But like I say in my article, give them as much as appropriate. Like really try. And when you do have problems, that's an issue for training. You train people up so they know what they should be doing.
It's like err on the side of more access rather than less access, and keep people around you can trust.
Exactly. Well, that's the other thing too. Yeah, if it's a matter of like, well, I've got this gift officer and I'm not sure they're gonna, they might not, or they might export our whole file and like run off with it. So, well, this is a reason to have NDAs, and to make sure you hire people and work with people that you can trust with that sort of information. You're never going to put so many, such a big iron cage around your data that they're not going to, do something wrong if they're really that untrustworthy. So I think you got to go to the source of that problem, which is maybe the employee.
Yeah. Yep. I think, yep. And that's exactly right. Personnel is policy. So here's a question. This came up earlier too. And this is one that I get all the time and have dealt with, I think, everywhere that I've worked. Should grants from grant-making foundations with reporting requirements and applications processes and LOIs be treated the same way in the system as you treat a simple John Smith sent me a check for $100? How important do those look the same?
Really good question. And if you also want me to get me talking endlessly, we can also talk about hard and soft credits, because this sort of relates a little bit to this. But
well, it does, and we should. Yes,
it does a little bit. But don't get me off on that. I'll be going all day. But when it comes to grants management, which is essentially what you're asking about, each system you're using, each platform you're using, is going to kind of handle this a little bit differently. But to the sort of viewpoint I take when it comes to grants and donations is that they're like concentric circles. So what happens oftentimes is that people receive a lot of grants from normal, everyday John Smiths of the world, right? And then they receive foundation grants from formal grant making, the formal application process. It's a formalized staff foundation, and they handle them the exact same way in the system. And the problem is that a grant, with all of its trappings, is not actually the same thing as a donation. The donation is part of a grant, so I don't want to confuse people too much. Your grant has a donation element to it. If I give $100 to an organization, you're gonna receive that, you're gonna thank me, and then you're gonna cultivate me. there still is that aspect to a grant, but a grant has a bunch of stages before that. Oftentimes you're sending them out a letter of inquiry. You got them on your kind of grant watch list. Maybe there's a formal application you're sending. Now you're following up with phone calls. There's multiple kind of steps to that process. Once you actually get that grant, it might be a pledge from that foundation that you're kind of tracking for a while. Then the grant comes in. That's where you have a donation. That's the actual donation itself. But the grant is still kind of a separate record. It's still kind of a separate thing because now you have to report on that. What was the outcome of the donation? What sort of impact did that have? What are how's it going to affect what you're asking for next year, right? So you've got all those reporting requirements after the fact. And you've got a lot of dates that are involved in all that. You've got a lot of different people that are involved in all that because you might be needing to get a lot of information from different sources to kind of appropriately report on that grant. So there's a lot of things involved in grants management. And the problem people have is they can tend to do two things. They try to track all of that on the same record or place that they just track the account. So let's, picking a foundation out of the hat, let's say I have the Walton Foundation, whatever their page on my database says. I try to track all the information about that grant right there on the account itself for the Walton Family Foundation. But the problem is I might have multiple grants over multiple years. And so you kind of, how many fields do I build for this, right? So you really kind of want to have its own place to manage grants. Similarly, they try and track it sometimes just on the donation. So they say, I've got this donation, I'm going to just use a donation record, a gift record, transaction record, whatever you call it. And they use that. But again, sometimes a grant can have multiple disbursements. So if you just use a single donation record, you start running into these issues where you've created multiple transactions for what was a single gift, granted on a single year, but just being dispersed in different years, and it becomes a huge mess. So all that being said, generally I recommend that your grants management is not completely the same as how you manage donation, individual donation transactions. Donations are a part of a grant, but a grant involves so much more. I hope I didn't make that clear as mud for folks.
I would say it was like 50% opacity on that.
All right, yeah.
So basically, I think that what I'm hearing is that in an ideal system, you have the system that you use to track donations and gift acknowledgement is separate from either your grants management system, which includes so much more information, and from if we were to take this on an individual level, separate from the way that your moves management system, right? Because in a lot of ways, foundations are people too, right? They just have way more dates and deadlines. So you actually want to have your moves management and your grants management living in the same ecosystem where they can interact with the donations, but you don't want every donation to have all of those same fields on it that you would want.
Exactly. Don't try and use the same the same object or table, whatever you might call it in your database. Don't use the same sort of thing to track those different things because they have slightly different needs and have slightly different fields.
Yeah, it's relationship management is actually different from donation management. That's kind of what this boils down to. And that don't try to make the one system do two things. Let them be separate. Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay, that's so helpful. We didn't really get into soft credits, and Austin, I see you have something that you wanted to contribute.
Well, I was just going to go to this question just from the chat box, which is related to this. It's a tough question. I'm going to make it harder because there's sort of a bigger problem here. Is in a database, we've got these different types of records. Like you'll know what I'm saying and make it more clear. Like accounts, households, individuals, all these different ways of putting people into a database. And that works in the database in one sense, but in real life, donors are people and they're married and they've got kids and they've got jobs and foundations and donor advised funds. So you might have a married couple who donates to you and then they get separated, or one passes away, or they have kids who are, part of the record and then they become donors. Or you've got somebody, and this is the original question from the chat box, you've got somebody who gives through a foundation and personally and through their business or a donor advised fund. How do we put all of this together? How do you manage all these different pieces? Good luck.
And you only give me 20 minutes left to say it all, right? So I'll say a couple of things because you kind of hit on like architecture of your database, and then we also went to kind of soft and hard credits, honestly. We'll capture it all. Hopefully, and of course, dig more in depth, on the call or one-on-one if people have more questions about it. I would say One thing people need to do is don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. And with that, this is a really useful saying that I repeat to myself and I repeat to my clients. And even though it doesn't necessarily answer people's specific questions in a specific situation, again, I think it's a useful framework to look at this problem through. And it is, build your system, build your processes for the rules, not the exceptions. So if I'm looking at how I build my database, I have all of these exceptions, and that freaks me out. What do I do about people getting divorced? What do I do about people getting married? What do I do about, this person's single and these people are married? Is that still a household? Is it a household of one? Should somebody be an individual versus a married household? How should we handle this? Build your system for the rules. And the rules are, we have giving units at the end of the day. And it's a very impersonal way to think about it, but we have giving units. Those giving units in a lot of different database systems, platforms, will be called something like accounts, constituent records. Sometimes in some systems, they're even called contacts, but it's like, this is the giving unit itself. And examples of those in real world terms are households, foundations, corporate givers, the people that are giving money, right? So we have those giving units. Then most databases are also going to have a sort of subset. And those are essentially individuals connected to the giving units. So if you were using Salesforce, you'd have accounts and contacts. If you're using Virtuous, you'd have contacts and individuals. There's a number of other different systems. They all use some variation of that terminology. You have basically the giving unit and individuals tied to the giving unit. So the giving unit's what's actually giving us the money. That's who we have, that's considered the donor. We kind of think of it like the IRS, if you file taxes for your household, it might be a household of one, might be a multi, might be a head of household or a married couple or something like that. But at the end of the day, the donor is the giving unit. When it comes to, what happens if I have some exceptions where people get divorced or people, do get married and those sorts of things. That's where you have to kind of take it on a case-by-case basis and decide, okay, if these people are divorced, do we just break them up into two different giving units now? Yeah, might make sense. Maybe you don't have any relationship with the person, one of the people that got divorced, and you only have a relationship with the other one. So maybe there's no need to actually break it out. If you've got kids that were formerly a part of a giving unit, maybe they're creating their own giving unit, right? So we go ahead and create those. You can, of course, add fields that kind of give some sort of relationship connection between different households and individuals and that sort of stuff. And that's useful to a degree, but I do find organizations sometimes major on that, where they're so concerned that every individual contact has a very clear relationship to every other individual contact. It becomes a spider web. And I have to sit back and think, and when are you actually going to use that? Like, when do you actually need that information? Sometimes you do. Sometimes if it's like, well, this person's, with this household, but they're also a board member to this foundation or something like that. Okay, that matters. That might be useful. But just capturing everybody's son and daughter and granddaughter and everything as a matter of, we've got to keep it all tied together and in a big spider web. Sometimes it's more work than it's worth. It depends on the use cases, depends on the organization, but it can be more work than it's worth. So all that basically being said is every platform you have has some structure that's kind of built like that. And you want to kind of set up your system and worry about the rules and not the exceptions to those rules. Now, to dig into, should I go on to hard and soft credits, or do you want to stop me there?
Well,
No, go ahead, Celia.
I was going to say, I want to summarize first, because then I do want to talk about hard and soft credits, because that always comes up. But so basically, to summarize what you're saying, Devon, is that what you want to do is follow the money, like set your system up in a manner that facilitates actually following the checkbooks, not the people's third cousins, aunts once removed, whatever. Like, it actually, are they the same giving unit? Then they should be tied together. Are they separate giving units? Then they should be separated.
In super rare instances, I have a client who says, but this household are two different giving units. The husband and the wife are both separate board members and they want to be tracked as separate giving units. What should I do? They're separate giving units then, I guess, like that's a one-off sort of oddball situation where I guess you create separate accounts for them and just have to be a little more careful about how you handle it. But they want to receive separate mail, want to receive separate, cultivation, then they're separate giving units, right? Mm-hmm. So, you just kind of deal with those one-off situations.
Yeah. Sometimes people divorce and separate their giving, and sometimes they don't. You got the Griffin versus the McCaws, right? Like, it just, it's case by case in those situations.
And one of the things to think about those exceptions is, like, they're going to be few enough that, and then you have to do risk assessment. If it's risky, it's because they're big donors, right? And then somebody should have a personal relationship there that they don't need the spider web of things on the back end. They should know. Put notes in there so that, it's there, but we don't need it automated in there. And if they're not big donors and, something disappears or you lose some piece of information, there's going to be a lot of that. And you can't save everything. That's the risk assessment. There's going to be small people who slip through the cracks, and that's okay.
Yep. I see here. I'll just take the wheel because I see here a number of people have mentioned soft credits. I don't know how these people got onto this call, but this is like my crowd. I'm never more excited than talking about soft and hard credits. It's like one of my favorite speeches to give for clients. So let me start off by saying soft and hard credits are made way more complicated than they need to be. They're not that scary. They're really not that bad. The other thing I have to caveat this with is that every different system has a different way of handling hard and soft credits. And in my opinion, most of them all suck because they make it too complicated and they point things in the wrong direction and people don't necessarily have a clear idea of what hard and soft credits are. So first off, let's actually make sure everybody's on the exact same page. When they hear the terms hard and soft credit, what the heck is Devon talking about? If Devon Ironside donates to a nonprofit, $100, he sends the check in, they send him a tax receipt, they send him a thank you letter, they cultivate it. Like a lot of our donors, that happens all the time. Without even thinking about it, you've given him hard and soft credit. It's a real thing everybody gets. We just never think about hard and soft credit. Because when a simple person gives a simple donation, you never have to split it. The only time you actually care about soft and hard credits is when you actually need to split them. So simply put, and we'll talk about what this looks like, the hard credit is what the IRS cares about. It's where the money left the bank. It's the actual bank account and or giving unit that gave you the money. The soft credit, on the other hand, is what you care about, who you care about, who you have a relationship with, who you cultivate, most likely who you asked for the gift. So an example of what that looks like. If Devon Ironside now cuts you a check from his plumbing company, right? $5,000 check from my plumbing company. You're like, thank you very much, Devon Ironside, right? The hard credit is what the IRS cares about. That's what gets the tax receipt. That goes to the plumbing company because the plumbing company is the one that actually is going to take that write-off. But the soft credit goes to Devon Ironside because Devon's your donor. He's the one you have the relationship with. He's the one you're cultivating. He's the one you're thanking and stewarding. So he gets the soft credit. And why do we do it that way? Because let's say Devon doesn't just give through his own pocket. He gives to his plumbing company. Maybe he gives to a couple of different channels. We want to make sure that we're soft crediting everything to Devon so I can get a holistic view of Devon's financial commitment to us as an organization. So at the end of the year, in our end of year printout that we send to everybody, thanking them, we have all of our donors, and it says, hey, Devon Ironside, he's a donor at $100. So I'm going to hold on a second. I gave you guys over $5,000. I gave you a check at your event, but I also responded to direct mail, and then I also directed some money from my family foundation, and I cut you a check from my plumbing company. I might have a bunch of different channels I gave to, right? And so it becomes this nightmare where you're like, well, shoot, we've got to find 4 or 5 different accounts and remember to pull all those together so we can see really what Devon gave us. And so in an ideal system, you would always put the donations themselves in the system. And the way I like to do it is you put the donation in and you always put it under the soft credit account. Now, I'll just speak from experience. When I built a Salesforce system, this is the way I do it. Most systems do not do it this way. So you might go home and you might look at your system, you might look at your database, you say, this isn't the way Devon described it. That's understandable because the way they're doing it may be slightly different, but the concepts are the same. They're trying to accomplish the same thing. So even if you understand the concept, if they're doing it in a different direction, that's fine. But when I build a Salesforce system, I like to say to everyone, you put your donations under the soft credit. And why do I do that? So that no matter what vehicle the donation came through, it all got tied to Devon first. And then it got directed to the hard credit account. Because I don't really care that much about it. I need to make sure to get tax receipts. I need to maybe report it on my 990, depending on how much I'm getting. This happens a lot from your Fidelity, Schwab, Vanguard charitable trusts, where donor advised funds or trusts are giving you money. But I like to tie it to that soft credit person, the true donor you care about, and then direct it to the hard credit account. What happens in a lot of databases, especially a lot of your off-the-shelf plug-and-play sort of databases, is the reverse. They actually have you put the donation on the hard credit account and soft credit it down to Devon Ironside. So that's okay. I don't like it. I think it's a dumb way of doing it, but that's okay. But what you need to be cognizant then of is you need to think, and you need to talk to your admin, and I can't speak to specific systems necessarily because each one's a little bit different, but you need to think about, okay, if I'm pulling a report for Devon Ironside and I want to see all the donations he's given to us, truly, like everything he's responsible for, then if I pull total donations from Devon, is that going to capture all the soft credits that were supposed to come in from his different giving vehicles? Or is there a different field I need to pull that maybe incorporates everything, both his personal giving and the giving he's directed through other vehicles? So when you're pulling those reports, just keep in mind that maybe you need to pull a different field to get a holistic view. Most systems have some way of capturing hard and soft credits. I don't like the way most systems do it, but that's what hard and soft credits are. At least if you kind of know what it is it's trying to accomplish, it can help hopefully make sense of what your system's trying to do with it. And if you have a system that just really is terrible at doing that, that might be a sign that you need to move to a different system. I wouldn't say it's the only one, but it's definitely a real pain in the butt for people. A bunch of people asked about that in the chat, so I really hope that's cleared something up for people. Of course, I'm always happy to speak about specific issues if people want.
Yeah. Again, that's also a perfect segue because you ended, Devon, saying this might be a reason to switch to another platform, which is where I want to go. Before I do that, this will be our last question, I think. So let me do the end matter, and then we'll let you talk straight into the end, and everybody can filter out when they've got to head to their next meeting. So first of all, thank you, Cecilia, for being here. Thank you, Devon. This was really good. There were a couple questions about a recording, which we'll share by email next week. We'll put it on YouTube. We'll email it out to everybody. We'll include Devon's email address in there too, so you can reach out to Devon if you have some questions. The hard credit, soft credit stuff is confusing. You might want to be in touch with him. I'll commission him right now to write a Philanthropy Daily article about hard and soft credits, and we'll put that up for everybody to read. And the last thing I want to mention before I go back to Devon, we have a masterclass next week. Let me get the date, January 13th. It's at 1:00 p.m. It's a 3-hour hands-on class. This week, we're talking about the lost $500 donor, retaining and upgrading tomorrow's major donors today. It's a catchy name to talk about building a mid-level donor pipeline, right? So often you're thinking about major donors, you're thinking about direct mail. What happens to these people who are ready to become major donors, but aren't there yet? What do you do with them? Matt Gerken, one of the partners in American Philanthropic, and Kyle Vandermeulen, the managing director here, is going to talk about that for you. It is $250 to sign up, and we have 5 slots left. I'll do the quick math on that for you. If you get one person to upgrade from $500 to $750 because of what you learned, that covers the cost of the class. We will send a link to that in the email. You can sign up there. You can also email me anytime. Okay, Devon, here's your last question. Send us out in a bang. We've been through everything, right? We've talked about processes, people, and perceptions. Okay. And so the last question is, when are you ready to switch platforms? I want to link it into a question we received in the Q&A too, though. So say you're a really small nonprofit, you just started. How do you decide which CRM to use? And until you have one, where should you be saving your information? So let's say, like, when do I know when to switch, and what do I decide if I'm big or small?
Yeah, maybe I start with the second portion first, because I would say CRMs, nonprofit databases kind of come in a couple of different, sizes and options, right? The very most rudimentary one that people will do is they'll say, I've got nowhere else, I'm going to keep stuff in Excel. If worst comes to worst and you want to keep something in a spreadsheet sort of format like that, do not keep it in Excel. At the very least, put it in something like Airtable, Smartsheet, even Google Sheets, which is my favorite, but something like that is at least an online, cloud-based, a lot more functionality for at least a normal end user who is in an Excel wonk. and capture your donors, capture your donations there. You can use different tables and stuff, and you can at least get something, in there. And you can get your, data in there clean. You can use your donors in there clean. Is it by any means an ideal situation for a large organization, or if you're growing fast? No, but it is better than nothing if you're looking for the better than nothing. You have options on the far end of the spectrum, like a Salesforce and a Microsoft Dynamics, that are very customizable. The issue with that is it's like a box of Lego with no instructions. So you need to make sure that either you have the capability or you're working with somebody who has the capability to build you the house your data is going to live in, because it doesn't come pre-built for you. In the middle are a lot of options, some different options we like. We really like Virtuous, Kindful, Bloomerang, Neon are other very popular ones. And there's a million different nonprofit CRMs out there. But where those sort of solutions thrive is they're purpose-built for nonprofits. They kind of have done the thinking for you. They've got a lot of built-in functionality baked right into the cake, and they're very good for those sorts of organizations that they're not like brand new, but they need something that's going to work. It's going to work pretty quickly. It's got a lot of functionality that nonprofits need. Forms, payment processing, some email marketing capabilities, all those different sorts of things. You can look at them and see what they do for you. So a lot of times people will run into one of those sorts of solutions, at least in the mid game, where they don't have crazy customization level needs. What I would say, as far as if you've gone through your perceptions and your people and your processes, and you say, well, look, all of those seem to be good. How do we know if the platform's actually our problem? I basically start looking at, okay, well, is the system you're on truly preventing you from doing what it is you need to do? Like, if I need to be able to capture volunteers because I'm a volunteer-heavy organization and I'm using, some product, let's just pick on Razor's Edge or Blackbaud, because Razor's Edge and Blackbaud suck. And by the way, you'll note I did not recommend anybody go to Razor's Edge or Blackbaud. You're using them and they just don't have good tools for what you need. Then hey, that's a good sign. Like, the platform's actually the problem. They don't have the functionality that you need. Maybe you have to, plug in your marketing software, like a HubSpot or a MailChimp or Constant Contact, with your development database, and whatever development database you're using just does not have the functionality to do that. That might be a sign where, okay, your platform's the limitation there. So if you've got a system that's preventing you from doing what you can do, there's no way it can grow. So, hey, it's great for, sometimes I'll apply this using Nation Builder and some of these things that are used for more like political activation and that sort of stuff, but it's never going to grow with you. You can't build more fields or customize it, build a new table or object. That's going to also be a reason why, we just need to move to a new platform that can actually grow with us. If there's functionality that you require that doesn't have, that's a reason. The biggest thing I would point people to, I'm supposed to leave you with a bang, so hopefully this does it, is that you should always be migrating to a new database, a new platform. Never migrate away purely from another database. And by that I mean, don't just try and escape something, because you might jump from one pit into another pit because you're just trying to escape something terrible. And you call up somebody at one of these big firms, and the nice salesman promises you the world and a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, and you sell your soul to the devil, and now you're in a contract for a number of other years, right? Make sure you're going to something that you know can work for you, that's got the functionality you need, that you feel good about. Don't just be trying to escape a bad system.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So let me summarize that really quickly. So to the answer of like a small new nonprofit, don't go Excel, go a shared space like Airtable or Google Sheets or something like that. And then when you're going to move, either a small one growing out of Airtable or someone growing out of Nowhere, this is a good line, like, something, jump to something, not from something. But this is what you've said to me in the past, which I think is helpful, is remember that the salesman is selling you something. And it's important to talk to somebody about the problems first. This is the whole point of this conversation. Don't just jump to the solution, identify the problems and talk there. And that's what you're always really helpful with, obviously, Devon, is seeing a lot of the databases and the end users need, bring them into the conversation. What do they actually need to identify where they want to go? And this ties into one of the questions, I think it's the last question we haven't gotten to yet, actually. One of the things that happens is fundraisers who don't want to be keeping records in the database, right? So this is why you bring them into the conversation about where they go, to make sure that, they have buy-in there. But Celia, you deal with this a lot. We've talked about this a lot, obviously. Can you just address that? So Celia, you actually get to send us off with a bang dealing with this question.
Okay. Yeah, I think Moira, hopefully you're still here. I I see that you asked a question about how to strong arm your fundraisers and to stop using Google Sheets and to start using your database system. And I would say you make it part of their continued employment agreement with the company, basically. I feel really strongly about this. And the reason is that when you have good fundraisers who are going out raising money for the organization, those donors do not belong to the fundraiser. The fundraiser may have personal relationships, but when that fundraiser leaves, the donor should continue to be involved with the organization. So a lot of times fundraisers will say like, oh, well, I don't trust the system, so I don't want my donor records in there. At which point it's the role of whoever is managing the system or managing the fundraisers to say, I'm so sorry. Those are not your donors. Those are our donors. That knowledge belongs to us. It is proprietary. You will die one day and our institution will continue and we will still need this information. So you must put this into our system. And I mean, obviously you don't want to start at the nuclear option, as I basically just did, but I think it's appropriate to be fairly strong arming about this. And if you want to take a more tactful approach, as Austin did, depending on where you are in this battle with your fundraisers and the database system, get to the bottom of why they don't want to use it. Are people pulling data wrong? Are people being emailed inappropriately? Is the Marcom team going wild and sending communications without telling people? Figure out what it is they don't trust about the database, try to fix that for them. And then once it's fixed, foist them into it.
Let me add one really minor and quick practical note, a slightly milder option for people that they can throw into their quiver as far as an option is oftentimes people only use the database to measure outputs. And our outputs are donations and pledges and that sort of stuff, right? So they say, oh, we've got these donations that come in, that's a measure of our success. But if you give them goals to measure their inputs, are you calling people? Are you logging tasks for the meetings you're having, the Zoom calls, that sort of stuff? That's a great way to drive them towards the database. So you say, look, I've got this goal for you. If it doesn't show up in the database, it didn't happen. And so you're kind of you're cultivating them to kind of put those inputs, and that we can have goals on that. And you can measure not only inputs but outputs. Then you can go nuclear.
That's a really good point. And this is how you really measure fundraising work and fundraising success is inputs, right? Because you can address and assess those and see how they correspond to outputs. Devon, thank you very much. We used to call Devon the Salesforce guru, but now we know to call him the Salesforce Lego master to build our house. Thank you for helping us understand that. Celia, thank you for asking all the really good questions and helping us think about it from the fundraiser's perspective. And thanks everybody for joining us today. I hope this is a helpful conversation. Again, email coming with recording next week, along with a link to sign up to the masterclass to learn about your mid-level donor pipeline, and Devon's email so you can ask him more about hard and soft credits. Lots more coming this year. We'll share it all on there, and we'll see you next time. Thanks very much. Thanks. Bye, guys.